Spinal adjustments provided by Dr. Chad Rolfson. The Spinal Tuning Chiropractic Center is a Des Moines area low flat fee per month unlimited chiropractic care practice. When life happens, just adjust. Schedule today at spinaltuning.com. Welcome to One-on-One. I am your host, Jimmy Olson, and joining me today is the Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference, Tom Chapman. Tom, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Some really good weather we've been seeing here for a few days.
Yeah, this is ridiculously nice for August. I can tell you that. Usually it's the closer we get to school, the hotter it gets, but this has been beautiful this week.
And of course, the one year that we end up not having the fair, it's like beautiful weather. But then again, they're talking, humidity again by the weekend. So we'll see how mid-August actually turns out.
Yeah, we'll actually get some state fair weather, I'm sure, by the time we're done. So,
well, so today we're going to maybe do a little educational piece on One-on-One. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But before we get to that, Tom, just kind of what is the Iowa Catholic Conference?
Sure. The Iowa Catholic Conference is the public policy agency for the Catholic bishops in Iowa. So the 4 Catholic bishops in Iowa are my bosses. And basically my main job during the legislative session is to be up at the Capitol advocating the things that the Catholic Church is interested in. So typically that would be pro-life issues, social justice issues, and Catholic schools. Those are the things that I spend most of my time on during the session. And then outside the session, we're doing a lot of prep work and meeting with legislators and getting our legislative agenda ready for the next year.
Speaking of social justice issues, we've been kind of seeing that a lot lately in the news.
Well, yeah, from our perspective, social justice, as far as the Catholic Church means that things that are important for the flourishing of people. And so obviously we always start with the human life and dignity of every human person. And then we want everyone to do well and flourish. And so those are the types of things that we work on, when we talk about social justice.
So, and so again, as we have this conversation, I wanted to talk to you because you're kind of like not the actual people voting, but in kind of a way, you're a lobbyist, which is all part of this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I mean, it's fair to call me a lobbyist. I'm up there every day talking to legislators, attending committee meetings, helping legislators with ideas for, bills and things that might get worked on. Advocate for that. And then another big piece of what we do is we try to encourage, the community, particularly the Catholic community in my case, to get involved and contact their legislator. Because one of the things that happens, is if you don't contact your legislator, they're going to go on without you. And they're going to make decisions maybe without your input. And so I think that's very important.
Well, the reality is life still goes on no matter what's happening around us. So, all right, here we go. The very first comment to it. We're going back to Schoolhouse Rock is what we're doing here. And anyone who remembers, I remember growing up watching it. And you know what? I thought it was always fun every Saturday morning when I'm watching my cartoons. And then, it would pop up. And I think one of the favorites that I have is How a Bill Becomes a Law.
Yes. And that's everyone remembers that one, and certainly I do. I'm in that age group too that remembers watching that. But basically, it starts from an idea,
right?
And that idea can be from a legislator, or sometimes it's from just your average person, a constituent that talks to a legislator about something that's happening in the community. It could come from interest groups or government agencies. It could come from groups like the Catholic Conference. We come up with ideas. So ideas come from a lot of perspectives. But here in Iowa, laws only come from bills that are introduced by legislators. So individuals, like us or interest groups, we don't get to introduce a bill. We have to find a legislator who might be interested in doing that. So really, once that idea comes forth, the legislator will go to the Legislative Services Agency and ask for a bill draft. And so there are lawyers that work for the Legislative Services Agency. They take the input from the legislator, and then they actually draft a bill. And once that bill is drafted, during the session, it is sent out to the Senate, president, and to the Speaker of the House. The bill gets assigned a number, and then it's actually introduced. It's actually introduced into the chamber. And then at that point, the president of the Senate or the Speaker of the House will assign that bill to a particular committee. And then the committee chair will assign a subcommittee to that, and then that subcommittee may or may not meet to consider the bill. But that's really the first part of the process, is you have to get it drafted, it has to go to a committee, it gets assigned to a subcommittee, and then the subcommittee may meet.
Well, and that was kind of the big thing you said right there. It's a process. Again, you're listening to One-on-One. I am your host, Jimmy Olson, chatting with Tom Chapman, Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference, chatting about how a bill becomes a law. So let's go back to that word you just used, process. Now, this is a process that can take roughly how long before the starting of the being introduced, before it can either go to a vote with, for the state, or a vote to the people to vote on it?
Well, the honest answer to that is it could take a week for the whole process, or it could take decades, in some cases, and everything in between. There are things that I've worked on at the legislature for literally almost 10 years before it would become law. And it starts to get introduced, and then maybe every year it might take a couple steps forward and one step back, and it gets farther through the process. It gets passed a committee, passed by a committee, it gets passed by one chamber but not the other, those sorts of things. And it really can literally take years to get it done, or it can go very quickly. But typically, each legislative session is actually 2 years in Iowa. So, and it starts right after an election. So this fall, November 2020 is election day, and then they will come back in early January 2021, and that's the start of a new 2-year session. So bills can get introduced anytime during that session, and really they have 2 years to be dealt with before they have to start all over. So next year is a whole new year. Legislators will come up with ideas and introduce bills and start them through the process. And actually within a legislative session, they do have particular deadlines as well. Is that there's a bill, gets introduced early in the session. There's a point at which it has to get out of a committee to advance any farther, unless it's a budget bill. So that's kind of the first legislative, what they call a funnel deadline. So there's a first funnel that you have to make it through.
So I guess so introducing a bill, trying to turn that into a law, what is the goal? I mean, is it something that you want to get done during a legislative session, or is it something or does it go to where it ends up going over a couple different ones to where, okay, it's now passed, it's got through the committee, it makes it through the House, then it has to, make the next step into the Senate. I mean, how does that all, or House of Representatives, I mean, depending if we're talking federal level or state level, what is that goal? I mean, is the idea to get it done in a session, or are we talking at least a couple sessions to really make that through?
That's a great question. Generally, the idea is that you would get it done within that 2-year session.
Okay.
Because you would introduce it and then try to get it through sometime in that 2 years. And if it doesn't, then you have to kind of start all over. But also the reality is some ideas are really so new or haven't gotten very far in the past or whatever, that sometimes legislators do introduce a bill with just the idea, I just want to get this idea out there. Realistically, it's not going to go anywhere this year, but we just want to start talking about it. And as a legislator, I want to start talking about it and get people interested in it. With the idea is it's an understanding it's really not going to pass this session. So that does happen. But when you're serious about getting something passed, it really does have to happen within that 2-year period.
And there's certain things that, I mean, if it's really important, like a lot of things that we're seeing lately and even over the past few years, could they push something through to really get through both sides of that and get it done in a session if it needs to get done like now.
Yes, and that does happen very frequently. And we did see that actually with a bill that had to do with outlawing chokeholds by police in Iowa. That
Mm-hmm.
was kind of in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests. That actually took place. There were some initial discussions among legislators and the governor and some people over this course of 3 or 4 days. It actually got introduced, went through committees, went through a subcommittee of the whole, passed both chambers, and was signed all in the course of a day. It was
Oh,
done
wow.
in one day. And that's very unusual. And it was because it was a very unusual situation. But it does happen, and it can happen in one day. For the vast majority of bills, it will take us, it's a several month process at least.
Well, and I'm assuming like with that particular bill, it was one thing that you were dealing with and nothing was tied to it, where a lot of times, and we hear this in the media all the time, they're trying to, let's use that one as the scenario, since that was the conversation of the chokehold. It did get passed quickly, but let's say they wanted to, ban the police from doing the chokeholds, but then they start, again, Schoolhouse Rock, they talked about all this pork that they throw into that, all these other pieces that they just throw in for that spending. Are those the things that can like really slow those down, because you have, depending which side you are, they're not agreeing with what they're trying to pass through with that?
Absolutely. Things can get added, and that definitely would slow it down. This only happened the way it did because there was really almost unanimous approval among everyone that something needed to be done. If there had been any organized opposition to it by legislators, it would have just had to take longer to get it done. And that can happen anytime you have more than one point in a bill. And certainly budget bills, which are done at the end of the session, usually end up having a lot of different things in them.
Mm-hmm.
And often, it sounds silly, but, you might have a bill that, actually appropriates a couple of $1 billion. Well, they might spend most of their time talking about something that costs $200,000 in it,
and not even talk about that other piece
and
that's
not
in the
even
bill.
talk about the $1 billion,
Right.
So that can happen too, because that's politics.
Right. Absolutely. So, again, we're chatting with Tom Chapman, the executive director of the Iowa Catholic Conference. You're listening to One-on-One. I'm your host, Jimmy Olson. And so now let's go to that. So that's the basic idea of how the bill goes. It makes its way through. Now let's take that next step. So governor or president, they make a executive order, which then it doesn't really put it into law. You can, start acting upon it because they made this executive order, but it still then has to kind of go back through and make its way through the process.
Well, in theory, executive orders can only be done to clarify certain parts of what is already in the law. So in theory, and I say in theory because the lines are not always clear, a president...
What? Gray areas? What?
Yes, I know. Isn't that the truth? But a president or a governor cannot create law by an executive order, except in some emergency situations. And so certainly with the pandemic, we've seen governors, including here in Iowa, they have proclamations and that really do have the effect of law. But the truth is that's because the law gives them the authority in emergency situations. So really an executive order cannot take the place of law. Now, people try to stretch that, and governors and presidents in the past have certainly tried to stretch those things, and they do get taken to court on it, and sometimes it's upheld and sometimes it isn't. But really how that works is it only should be based on the powers that are given to them in the law.
Sure. So really what the idea is, it's more of a, here's what it says. And of course, we all know all law is, upon interpretation, and depending on what lawyer or judge or whoever you're talking to, which kind of makes it unfortunate a little bit, because you would think being a law, it should be black and white.
Yeah, and it is. Things are ambiguous, and actually things get passed in an ambiguous way. for a reason sometimes because they can't really come to an agreement. So everyone just agrees, well, we'll just kind of let that hang out there and be ambiguous, for now. It also happens that a president feels like they need to clarify something in the law, and so they will often put out an executive order. But myself personally, I'm not a big fan of executive orders that try to create new law because I think it takes it out of the democratic process. And it's better, and of course, a lobbyist would say that, of course, but it's better to have a chance for people like me, for example, and many other groups to have input into the bill and lawmaking process along the way, rather than just have something come from on high, that really maybe didn't have a lot of input. And so we like the idea of things going through a process, and that's where the people can weigh in.
Now, well, so again, if a president or a governor does try to do that, like I said, does it have to go back through the process, or does it actually kind of skip the process a little bit, and then, like you said, then it ends up having to go to court to be actually looked on over the Supreme Court to go, is this correct? Is this incorrect? Because I'll be honest, I was under the
Sure.
idea that if they come in, they make this executive order, that's fine and dandy, but guess what? Maybe we can follow it, but it still has to go back to the beginning. It's kind of like a way of them introducing an idea.
Yeah. Well, it can work both ways. Typically, an executive order does not directly go back to the legislature.
Okay.
If there's questions about it and opposition, then it goes to the courts, and the courts adjudicate it. Now, we may well see, right now, Governor Reynolds has said she's going to issue an executive order to allow people who have committed a felony and coming out of prison, it will allow them to vote. Now, depending upon whether legislators like the look of that executive order or not, that could become a topic for next January, for the legislature to actually weigh in on. But they're not really going to, come back into session and deal with that executive order now.
Sure.
That's something that they'll address later.
Well, and Iowa is the one of the only, or the only state that still does not allow felons to vote once they have done their time.
Right, done their time. Right now, we are the only state that by law, felons coming out of prison are not able to vote. That's the only state that we're the only ones left in that regard. And so once again, it would have been better for the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment to start that process of changing what our Constitution says about it. Because the Constitution basically says, anyone that's committed an infamous crime is not allowed to vote. Well, an infamous crime was found to be a felony by the state Supreme Court. And so that's where the, kind of the dispute is. And we'd like to change the Constitution, to make it possible for people to come out of prison and vote once they've served their sentence. I mean, that's the key.
And this isn't anything new, because, growing up in Iowa myself, they've been talking about this for years, actually.
Oh, yeah. And I came to find that actually the Iowa Catholic Conference has been involved in trying to, pass a constitutional amendment for many decades, to try to fix this. And once again, this is what I meant when I said it can take decades. I think eventually this is something that will be done in the Constitution.
Sure.
For now, the governor will do it by executive order. Eventually, I think the Constitution will get changed in that regard, but it's taken many, many years.
So let's kind of, not that we know exactly what they were thinking, 150 years ago when they mentioned it being a infamous, act. What were they thinking? Was it something major? And then they just dropped it to a felony?
Yeah. I'm not 100% clear on all of that in terms of what they exactly meant by infamous.
That's that whole ambiguous thing.
Yeah, and I just think that's what the interpretation was, because the Iowa Supreme Court went back and tried to, ascertain what were they really looking at in terms of an infamous crime. And looking at the context of the time and what the law says, the court agreed that really it meant any felony.
Hmm.
And so felonies, in Iowa are very wide. There's a wide range of felonies.
Sure.
And not that it's a good thing, but let's say you're 18 years old and you make a stupid mistake and you go out and you destroy, say, $1,500 worth of property,
Hmm.
which wouldn't be hard to do. That's a Class D felony.
Especially in
And
today's world, 1,500
yeah,
bucks is not much for damage.
no, and so if you're convicted of that felony, actually, then you could not ever vote again.
Hmm.
So that's the type of thing. Obviously there are some things that first degree murder, things like that, Class A felonies. Most people are going to say, people really have forfeited their right to vote if they do that. But things like that, there's definitely room for discussion.
Well, I mean, I think depending on the level of that, when it comes to your crime, but then, I mean, again, if a Class D felony, it could get you, 10, it could get you 15 years, it could get you 5 years, depending on what that
Sure.
is. Or sometimes you could be, you are given that you committed a felony, but then it's pay your restitution and there's not even time served. So then you
Right.
lose, like you
Yeah.
said. I mean, your voting is out.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it's that way. Really, from our perspective, if you've served the time, you've served the time. You've served
Hmm.
your sentence, and you should get another chance to vote and re-enter the political community. Because certainly, from the Catholic perspective, we believe it's very important for people to get involved in the political process. In fact, it's an obligation. And so that would really enhance that for people who come out of prison and help them to be members of the community, which I think is what we really all want.
Well, it comes back to of giving, growing up as Catholic or just growing up as a Christian. It's that second chance.
Yes,
You know,
absolutely. And Christianity is about second chances, and you know that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, chatting with Tom Chapman, Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference. I'm your host, Jimmy Olson. And this is a one-on-one. And yeah, we're kind of just having a conversation of how a bill becomes a law. And I really encourage you to go back to Schoolhouse Rock, which it's available on Disney Plus. I
Yeah,
actually,
absolutely. Yeah, I got to look that up, and see where that's at again.
I'm
I
sure you
mean,
could probably even find it on YouTube.
well, well, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. And even the legislative website has all of this information. There's a link they have on there on the Iowa legislative website that says resources and civic education. And you can really dig down deep into all of that process if you were interested.
Well, and I think it really comes down to is we need to be knowledgeable about what's going on and how processes work and not just go with the flow or just take, what someone says as gospel truth.
No, I really encourage people to get interested in what's going on at the legislature. Find the topic that you're really interested in and dig a little deeper into it. And actually, there's nothing that should stop you from trying to meet with your state legislator. They're very accessible for the most part. You could get a couple of your friends interested in the same issue and just ask this person to have these days you could have a Zoom meeting, or you could have a cup of coffee at some point when that's appropriate, things like that, and get together with them. But really, they're there. You're supposed to be their boss, right?
Right.
And so
A government
they're
for the
looking
people,
for
by
a
the people.
parade. Yeah, they're looking for a parade to get in front of,
Hmm.
And so you want to organize with other people and find your legislator and get them interested in what you're interested in. And many of them would like to do that, because most legislators I've found are pretty easy to get along with and are interested in what you have to say. There's a few clunkers, but that's the way it is everywhere, but for the most part, they want to help people and listen to what you're saying.
Absolutely. As Ronald Reagan said, but then again, it's right in scripture to trust but verify.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you better believe it. And I use that phrase all the time,
Hmm.
and I use that phrase with legislators, because a lot of legislators will say certain things, but not necessarily follow through. And so you have to do that with them and kind of keep them focused and interested in what you're about.
Well, me being in media for, 30 years, I mean, it really is, you get that information, you can trust that information, but you better verify that before you go public with it, because talk about egg on your face if you're wrong.
Right. It's important to have good sources of news, and I encourage people, to find different sources and not just depend on a particular source that agrees with you, ideologically or whatever. You've got to look a little wider to get a little broader perspective, and these days you have to do that if you want to really be well informed.
Well, and what I've found is a lot of times you really have to pay attention, because you could look at two different sources and each one of them is just giving you a piece of the information. And then you actually have to bring those together to really get into the understanding or what's actually happening.
Right. I mean, obviously, every group and every news media member and every interest group like ours, even, we all have a certain perspective in how we look at things. And that's why I think it's important to really reach out broader, talk to a lot of people in your friend group, but also, look for other sources of information. Because as you know, social media, as you, integrate and use that, it really tends to narrow your vision into things that people you really agree with, and that's not always going to be the best source of information.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you very much for your time. And again, I encourage everyone, go back to school, watch Schoolhouse Rock. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I'll be doing that tonight.
I
Great to talk with you.
Funny story on that real quick before I completely let you go. So now it's on Disney Plus, and like I said, we could probably find it on YouTube, but going back, this is probably 15, almost 20 years ago. Actually would have been almost 22 years ago. So before the internet is the way it is now, I was watching QVC one night, and they had the entire Schoolhouse Rock collection. So yes, I am the nerd, because I picked up the phone.
Yeah.
I gave him my credit card information.
Oh, wow. Well, I got the CD-ROM for my kids back in the day, and that was probably 20 years ago too. So absolutely. That's critical purchase information.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, Tom, thank you very much. We've been chatting with Tom Chapman, Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference. I am Jimmy Olson, your host for One on One. Be sure to subscribe to One on One. You can do that through Apple Podcasts, Google Play. It's also available on Spotify and iHeart app, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with your friends as well. Thanks for listening to One on One.